The elevator descended 47 floors below ground level, carrying Sarah Chun deeper into the heart of the National Cyber Defense Center than most personnel would ever go. Her security badge showed clearance for Level 3 operations, but tonight, she was heading to Level 12, where the air recycling systems hummed with a different frequency and every door required biometric confirmation. She clutched a tablet containing system diagnostics that should have taken 10 minutes to review, not the 3 hours she'd spent perfecting every detail. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 2 floors above her, the primary response team was already suiting up in the main operations theater. Elite cybersecurity specialists with decades of experience, multiple advanced degrees, and reputations that stretched across international intelligence communities. Names that appeared in classified briefings and congressional hearings. The kind of people who testified before Senate committees and authored papers that shaped national security doctrine. Sarah was not one of those people. Her title read Systems Integration Specialist, Secondary Support, which translated to monitoring server health during routine maintenance windows and running diagnostic protocols when the real experts needed coffee breaks. She'd held this position for 18 months, long enough to know that backup personnel weren't invited to crisis situations unless someone needed technical documentation retrieved or wanted fresh batteries for their equipment. Tonight was different. The emergency briefing had included her name on a list typically reserved for senior analysts and department heads. Not as a primary contributor, but as what the assignment sheet termed technical support liaison. Translation: she would sit in the corner with her laptop, ready to pull up system specifications if anyone asked, which they probably wouldn't. The crisis had begun 3 hours earlier, when sophisticated malware infiltrated the power grid management systems for the entire eastern seaboard. Not a random attack by amateur hackers looking for attention, but a coordinated assault that demonstrated intimate knowledge of infrastructure, vulnerabilities that weren't supposed to exist in public documentation. Someone had spent months, possibly years, mapping every security protocol, every backup system, every fail-safe mechanism that kept 60 million people supplied with reliable electricity. The attack had been elegant in its precision. Rather than causing immediate blackouts that would trigger emergency responses, the malware had embedded itself deep within scheduling algorithms, slowly manipulating load distribution patterns to create cascading instabilities that would manifest as seemingly natural system failures. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the malicious code would be so deeply integrated that removing it would require shutting down power to major metropolitan areas for weeks. Director Marcus Reynolds had assembled the agency's most experienced team within 45 minutes of threat confirmation. These were the specialists who had prevented cyber attacks on financial markets, protected election infrastructure from foreign interference, and traced sophisticated espionage networks back to their source countries. Their combined expertise represented decades of battling the most advanced threats that hostile nations could deploy. Sarah knew their names from departmental newsletters and annual reports. Dr. Amanda Foster, whose doctoral thesis on encryption vulnerabilities had become required reading at the National Security Agency. James Mitchell, who had spent 12 years with the FBI's cybercrime division before joining the civilian response team. Maria Santos, whose algorithms for threat pattern recognition had been classified at the highest level since their development. Linda Parker, whose work on infrastructure protection had earned her briefings with cabinet-level officials. Each of them commanded salaries that reflected their irreplaceable value to national security. Each had been personally recruited by Director Reynolds based on accomplishments that couldn't be fully disclosed even in classified personnel files. They were the primary team because no one else possessed their combination of technical expertise, operational experience, and security clearance necessary for this level of threat response. Sarah possessed none of these qualifications. Her computer science degree had been earned at a state university that wasn't known for producing cybersecurity experts. Her work experience consisted of 2 years at a regional telecommunications company and her current position monitoring systems that rarely required intervention. She had never briefed senior officials, never worked on classified projects that would be studied by future analysts, never been consulted on policy decisions that affected national infrastructure. Her specialty was understanding how different systems connected to each other, the mundane technical details that kept networks functioning smoothly. She knew which servers communicated with which databases, how data flowed through various processing layers, and where potential bottlenecks could develop under unusual conditions. Important knowledge for maintaining operational efficiency, but hardly the cutting-edge expertise needed to combat state-sponsored cyber warfare. The elevator stopped at level 12 with a soft chime that indicated arrival at restricted areas where conversations were monitored and every electronic device was logged. Sarah stepped into a corridor lined with reinforced doors, each marked with alphanumeric codes that designated purpose without revealing specific functions. Security cameras tracked her movement with subtle mechanical adjustments that indicated human oversight rather than automated surveillance. At the end of the hallway, double doors opened into the primary operations center, a space designed for managing crises that could affect millions of people. Multiple wall-mounted displays showed real-time data feeds from power generation facilities, transmission networks, and distribution systems across 17 states. Workstations arranged in precise rows accommodated analysts whose expertise spanned everything from malware analysis to international relations. The primary team had already claimed the central workstation cluster. Their equipment spread across multiple monitors displaying code analysis, network topology maps, and communication interfaces with utility companies. They moved with the practiced efficiency of specialists who had worked similar crises together, speaking in technical shorthand that assumed familiarity with concepts most people would need explained. Sarah took her assigned position at a secondary workstation positioned along the room's perimeter, close enough to observe the primary team's activities, but clearly separated from the decision-making cluster. Her role was to provide technical support when requested, which meant waiting quietly until someone needed information that wasn't immediately available through their primary systems. She opened her laptop and connected to the facility's secure network, running through the diagnostic protocols she'd prepared during her descent to level 12. Her screen filled with data streams showing power consumption patterns, generator output levels, and transmission line status indicators across the affected region. Familiar information displayed in formats she'd spent months learning to interpret, but tonight carried implications that transformed routine numbers into measures of national security. Director Reynolds stood at the front of the operations center, briefing arriving personnel on threat assessment details that painted a picture more sophisticated than initial reports had suggested. The attack wasn't just targeting power grid management systems, but had infiltrated backup communication networks, emergency response coordination databases, and even the computer systems that managed fuel supplies for backup generators. Someone had mapped the entire infrastructure ecosystem and identified points of vulnerability that could amplify a power grid failure into a complete breakdown of emergency services across multiple states. This wasn't cybercrime for financial gain or hacktivism designed to make political statements. This was warfare preparation, the kind of attack that preceded physical military action by creating conditions where target populations couldn't coordinate effective responses. The primary team began their analysis with systematic precision that reflected years of training and experience. Each member focused on specific aspects of the threat, dividing complex technical challenges into manageable components that could be addressed through established protocols and proven Methodologies. Sarah watched their work with professional admiration and personal anxiety. She understood enough about their specialties to recognize the sophistication of their approach, but also enough about the threat to realize they were facing something unprecedented in its complexity and scope. This wasn't a problem that could be solved through existing playbooks or previous experience with similar attacks. As the primary team dove deeper into their analysis, Sarah continued running her own diagnostic protocols, not because anyone had requested the information, but because understanding system relationships was what she did best. Her screens filled with connection maps that showed how different components of the power grid communicated with each other. Data flows that most analysts considered routine infrastructure details rather than critical intelligence. What she began to see in those routine details would soon transform her from backup personnel into the most important person in the room. Though none of them realized it yet, the operations center existed in a state of controlled chaos that most outsiders would find overwhelming. Dozens of analysts worked at workstations designed for maximum information density, each screen displaying data streams that updated in real time from monitoring stations scattered across the continental United States. The ambient lighting had been calibrated to reduce eye strain during extended operations, creating an environment where personnel could work for 12-hour shifts without losing focus or accuracy. Dr. Amanda Foster commanded the central analysis station with authority that came from solving problems that had stumped entire government agencies. Her fingers moved across multiple keyboards simultaneously, pulling up malware samples that had been isolated from infected systems and running them through analysis programs that existed nowhere outside classified facilities. Each piece of malicious code revealed layers of sophistication that spoke to resources and expertise typically associated with nation-state actors rather than criminal organizations. The malware had been designed with countermeasures that anticipated every standard detection method currently deployed by cybersecurity teams. Traditional signature-based scanning tools couldn't identify it because its code segments were disguised as legitimate system processes. Behavioral analysis programs struggled to flag it because its actions mimicked normal system optimization routines. Even advanced machine learning algorithms trained on thousands of previous attacks failed to recognize the threat patterns. Because this attack had been specifically engineered to exploit the blind spots in those detection systems. James Mitchell worked 3 stations away, his screens filled with network topology maps that showed the real-time status of power transmission infrastructure across 17 states. Each colored line represented thousands of miles of high-voltage cables carrying electricity from generation facilities to distribution centers that supplied millions of homes and businesses. His expertise lay in understanding how these networks functioned as integrated systems, where a failure in one location could cascade through interconnected pathways and create blackouts hundreds of miles away. The attack had targeted control systems that managed load balancing across the entire regional grid. Under normal circumstances, these systems automatically adjusted power distribution to match fluctuating demand throughout the day. Office buildings needed maximum electricity during business hours, while residential areas peaked in the early evening when people returned home. Industrial facilities operated on schedules that required careful coordination to prevent grid overload. During periods of high consumption, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The malware had infected the algorithms that performed these calculations, introducing subtle errors that would accumulate over time until the entire system became unstable, rather than causing immediate blackouts that would trigger emergency responses. The attack was designed to create conditions that would appear to be equipment failures or natural system degradation. By the time operators realized they were dealing with a coordinated attack, The malicious code would be so deeply embedded that removing it would require shutting down power to major metropolitan areas for extended periods. Maria Santos specialized in threat attribution, the complex process of determining who was responsible for sophisticated cyber attacks. Her workstation displayed communication intercepts, code analysis results, and intelligence reports that painted a picture of an adversary with access to classified information about American infrastructure vulnerabilities. This wasn't the work of amateur hackers or even organized criminal groups seeking financial gain. The level of preparation and technical sophistication indicated a well-funded operation with support from intelligence agencies that possessed intimate knowledge of target systems. The attack vector suggested months of preliminary reconnaissance, with attackers systematically mapping every component of the power grid's computer networks. They had identified backup systems, emergency protocols, and manual override procedures that weren't documented in any publicly available sources. Someone had either recruited insiders with access to classified infrastructure plans or had conducted surveillance operations that penetrated supposedly secure facilities. Linda Parker focused on defensive countermeasures, developing strategies for containing the attack and preventing further system penetration. Her screens showed real-time monitoring data from thousands of critical infrastructure components, each displaying status indicators that would change color if suspicious activity was detected. The challenge lay in distinguishing between normal system variations and evidence of malicious manipulation, especially when the attack had been designed to mimic legitimate operational patterns. Traditional cybersecurity responses relied on isolating infected systems and rebuilding them from clean backup copies. In this case, such measures would be catastrophic because the power grid required continuous operation to maintain basic services for millions of people. Hospitals relied on consistent electricity for life support equipment. Traffic control systems needed power to prevent accidents, and communication networks required stable energy supplies to coordinate emergency responses. The team faced a challenge that had never been successfully resolved in previous cyber warfare scenarios. They needed to remove sophisticated malware from actively operating systems without interrupting the critical services those systems provided. This required developing new techniques that could identify and neutralize malicious code while maintaining full operational capacity of infected infrastructure. Sarah observed these preparations from her peripheral workstation, running diagnostic protocols that generated detailed maps of system interconnections across the affected region. Her analysis revealed the complex relationships between power generation facilities, transmission networks, distribution centers, and the thousands of smaller systems that managed everything from voltage regulation to emergency switching procedures. Systems that managed everything from voltage regulation to emergency switching procedures. Expertise in system integration meant she understood how different components communicated with each other, often through pathways that weren't immediately obvious to specialists focused on specific technical domains. Power grid management systems didn't operate in isolation, but exchanged data with weather monitoring networks, fuel supply databases, maintenance scheduling programs, and even financial systems that managed electricity market transactions. These interconnections created potential attack vectors that might not be apparent to analysts examining individual system components. The malware could have spread through data-sharing protocols that connected the power grid to other critical infrastructure networks, creating a web of infected systems that extended far beyond the obvious targets. While the primary team focused on analyzing malware samples and developing containment strategies, Sarah traced data flows through the interconnected systems that supported power grid operations. Her screens displayed connection maps that revealed how information moved between different organizational boundaries, crossing from utility companies to government agencies to private contractors responsible for equipment maintenance and system Upgrades. Each connection represented a potential pathway for malware propagation, but also a possible avenue for implementing defensive measures that could isolate infected systems without disrupting critical operations. Sarah's understanding of these relationships had been developed through months of routine maintenance work that required coordinating updates across multiple organizational systems. Her analysis revealed patterns that the primary team hadn't yet discovered. The attack hadn't just targeted power grid control systems, but had infiltrated the backup communication networks that utility companies used to coordinate emergency responses. It had also penetrated the databases that managed fuel supplies for backup generators, potentially compromising the redundant systems designed to maintain power during grid failures. The sophistication of this multi-layered approach suggested attackers who understood American infrastructure vulnerabilities better than most government analysts. They had identified dependencies between different systems that weren't documented in official security assessments, exploiting relationships that existed due to practical operational requirements rather than formal design specifications. Sarah's diagnostic protocols began identifying anomalies in system communication patterns that indicated the malware had spread further than initial assessments suggested. The infection wasn't limited to power grid management systems, but had propagated through interconnected networks to compromise emergency services coordination, transportation management, and even the computer systems that controlled water treatment facilities. This discovery would soon transform her from a peripheral observer into the most critical member of the response team, though the primary analyst hadn't yet realized the implications of what her system integration expertise was revealing. About the true scope of the attack. Asterisk. The first anomaly appeared on Sarah's screen at 11:47 p.m., buried within routine data streams that most analysts would have dismissed as background noise. A tiny fluctuation in communication protocols between a water treatment facility in Baltimore and a backup power substation in Northern Virginia. The connection shouldn't have existed according to official infrastructure diagrams, yet her system integration protocols had detected active data exchange between facilities that were supposedly isolated from each other. Sarah stared at the anomaly for several minutes, running verification checks to ensure her diagnostic software wasn't producing false positives. The connection persisted across multiple scans, revealing a communication pathway that bypassed standard security protocols and operated through network segments that weren't monitored by conventional cybersecurity systems. 20 feet away, the primary team continued their methodical analysis of malware samples, unaware that their fundamental assumptions about the attack scope were about to be shattered. Dr. Foster had isolated several code segments that demonstrated advanced encryption techniques, while Mitchell was mapping power grid vulnerabilities that could be exploited for maximum disruption. Their work was brilliant, systematic, and focused on the wrong target. Sarah's discovery revealed that the attack wasn't just targeting power infrastructure, but had created a shadow network that connected critical systems across multiple domains. Water treatment, transportation management, emergency services coordination, fuel distribution, and communication networks had all been linked through pathways that existed outside official documentation. Someone had spent years mapping the hidden connections between systems that were never intended to communicate with each other. The implications struck her with the force of physical impact. This wasn't a cyber attack on the power grid. It was preparation for something far more devastating. The attackers had created the capability to simultaneously disrupt every critical infrastructure system that supported modern urban life: power, water, transportation, communications, emergency services, and fuel supplies could all be compromised through coordinated strikes that would key in, overwhelm any response capability. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled up additional diagnostic protocols, expanding her analysis to trace the full extent of the shadow network. Each new scan revealed more connections, more systems that had been quietly linked through pathways that existed in the spaces between official organizational boundaries. The scope grew beyond anything she had imagined possible. A hospital network in Philadelphia was connected to traffic management systems in Baltimore. Air traffic control databases were linked to water treatment facilities in Richmond. Emergency services dispatch systems had pathways to fuel distribution networks across 3 states. Every connection represented a potential failure point that could cascade into system-wide collapse. The attackers hadn't just infiltrated individual systems. They had rewired the entire regional infrastructure into a web of dependencies that could be manipulated to create catastrophic failures. A coordinated attack could shut down hospitals by disrupting both power and water supplies, while simultaneously preventing emergency responders from reaching affected areas by controlling traffic systems and disabling communication networks. Sarah realized she was looking at preparation for an attack that would make September 11th appear limited in scope. This wasn't terrorism designed to create fear through spectacular destruction. This was warfare preparation that could reduce major metropolitan areas to pre-industrial conditions within hours, creating humanitarian crises that would require months to resolve. The weight of her discovery pressed against her chest like a physical force. She was sitting in a room full of the nation's most experienced cybersecurity experts, yet she was the only person who understood what they were actually facing. Her routine diagnostic protocols had revealed a threat that the primary team's sophisticated analysis had completely missed. Protocol demanded that she report her findings through proper channels. She should document her discoveries, prepare a briefing presentation, and request time to present her analysis to Director Reynolds. Standard procedures existed for situations where support personnel identified information relevant to ongoing operations. Those procedures were designed to ensure that important discoveries reached decision-makers through appropriate chains of command, but following protocol would consume precious time that might not be available. The shadow network she had discovered was actively operating, which meant the attackers could trigger their coordinated strike at any moment. Every minute spent on proper documentation and presentation procedures was another minute closer to potential catastrophe. Sarah faced a choice that would define not only her career, but potentially the fate of millions of people. She could follow established procedures and hope that the primary team would understand the implications of her discoveries quickly enough to develop effective countermeasures. Or she could abandon her designated role as backup personnel and force the attention of experts who had no reason to listen to someone with her limited credentials. The primary team's workstations displayed analysis results that grew more sophisticated by the hour. Their expertise was undeniable, their methods proven through years of successful operations. They were attacking the problem with systematic precision that had resolved previous crises. But they were analyzing individual trees while missing the forest that connected them all. Dr. Foster's malware analysis had identified code signatures that indicated state-sponsored development, confirming that America was facing an attack from a hostile nation with advanced cyber warfare capabilities. Mitchell's network topology analysis revealed power grid vulnerabilities that could be exploited to create cascading failures affecting millions of people. Santos had traced communication patterns that suggested coordination between multiple attack teams operating from different geographic locations. Their work was brilliant and completely insufficient. They were preparing defenses against a power grid attack, while the real threat involved coordinated strikes against every critical infrastructure system simultaneously. Their countermeasures would be irrelevant if hospitals lost both power and water, while emergency responders couldn't communicate or navigate through cities where traffic control systems had been compromised. Sarah's diagnostic protocols continued revealing new connections within the shadow network. Each discovery confirmed that the attack scope exceeded anything the cybersecurity community had previously encountered. The attackers possessed intimate knowledge of American infrastructure that surpassed official government assessments. They had identified dependencies and vulnerabilities that existed due to practical operational requirements rather than formal design specifications. The sophistication of their preparation suggested resources that only nation-states could provide, combined with planning that had extended over multiple years. Someone had systematically mapped every critical system that supported modern urban life, identified the hidden connections between those systems, and created the capability to manipulate them all through coordinated cyber attacks. Sarah's understanding of system integration had revealed what the primary team's specialized expertise had missed. Their focus on individual technical domains had blinded them to the relationships between different infrastructure networks. They were defending against attacks on specific systems, while the real threat involved weaponizing the connections between those systems. The moment of decision arrived with crystalline clarity. She could remain in her designated role as backup personnel, following protocols that would ensure her discoveries eventually reached the right people through proper channels. Or she could risk her career, her security clearance, and her professional reputation by interrupting the primary team's work to share discoveries that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the threat they were facing. The numbers on her screen continued updating in real time, each new data point confirming that millions of people were vulnerable to an attack that could begin at any moment. The shadow network was operational, the attacking systems were in position, and the only thing preventing catastrophe was the attacker's choice of timing. Sarah made her decision with the same clarity that had guided her diagnostic analysis. She saved her data to encrypted files, grabbed her laptop, and walked toward the primary team's workstation cluster. Every step carried her further from the safety of her designated role and closer to a confrontation that would transform her from backup personnel into either the person who prevented a national catastrophe or the analyst who disrupted critical operations with unfounded theories. The primary team noticed her approach with expressions that ranged from curiosity to mild annoyance. Support personnel didn't typically interrupt senior analysts during crisis operations unless they had been specifically requested to provide assistance. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she prepared to challenge the expertise of people whose credentials dwarfed her own. Dr. Foster looked up from her malware analysis with professional courtesy that barely concealed impatience. Sarah took a breath that felt like preparation for jumping from a great height and began explaining discoveries that would change everything. Dr. Foster's initial reaction to Sarah's interruption was predictably dismissive. "Ms. Chun, we're in the middle of critical analysis. If you have system reports, please file them through standard channels and we'll review them when time permits." Her tone carried the polite authority of someone accustomed to managing interruptions from well-meaning but misguided support staff. Sarah placed her laptop on the edge of Foster's workstation and opened the diagnostic displays that revealed the shadow network's full scope. "Doctor, I need you to look at this immediately. The attack isn't targeting just power systems. They've connected everything." Her voice carried an urgency that made Foster pause her malware analysis and glance at the unfamiliar data patterns filling Sarah's screen. The connection maps displayed a web of communication pathways that linked disparate infrastructure systems across 17 states. Water treatment facilities in Maryland connected to emergency dispatch centers in Pennsylvania. Hospital networks in Virginia linked to transportation management systems in Delaware. Air traffic control databases sharing data streams with fuel distribution networks that supplied backup generators for critical facilities. Foster's expression shifted from annoyance to confusion as she processed the implications of what Sarah was showing her. "These connections don't exist in any official documentation. Our threat assessments are based on isolated system vulnerabilities, not integrated network dependencies." She called Mitchell and Santos over to examine Sarah's findings, her voice carrying new urgency that drew immediate attention from the other specialists. Mitchell studied the network topology maps with growing alarm. His expertise in power grid management had focused on protecting electrical infrastructure from targeted attacks. But Sarah's discovery revealed that power systems were just one component of a much larger target. If they can coordinate strikes across all these systems simultaneously, we're not looking at a power grid attack. We're looking at complete infrastructure collapse. Santos began tracing the communication pathways through her threat attribution databases, searching for evidence of how the shadow network had been established without detection by any monitoring systems. Her analysis revealed that the connections had been created gradually over multiple years, using legitimate administrative access credentials to establish data, sharing protocols that appeared to serve operational purposes. "This is sophisticated, beyond anything we've encountered," Santos reported, her voice tight with professional concern. "They didn't hack these systems, they engineered them." Someone with insider access to multiple infrastructure organizations spent years creating these connections while making them appear to be routine operational improvements. The implications struck the primary team with devastating clarity. They weren't dealing with external attackers who had penetrated American infrastructure through technical vulnerabilities. They were facing adversaries who had systematically corrupted the infrastructure's design through long-term infiltration of the organizations responsible for managing critical systems. Dr. Foster turned to Sarah with new respect mixed with professional urgency. "How did your diagnostic protocols detect these connections when our analysis systems missed them completely?" The question carried genuine curiosity rather than defensive skepticism, a recognition that Sarah's background in system integration had revealed blind spots in their specialized expertise. Sarah explained her methodology for tracing data flows across organizational boundaries, a process that required understanding how different agencies coordinated their operations through informal communication pathways that weren't documented in official system architectures. Her work involved mapping the practical relationships that existed due to operational necessity rather than formal design specifications. Most cybersecurity analysis focuses on protecting individual systems from external threats, Sarah continued. But infrastructure systems don't operate in isolation. They share data for legitimate operational reasons that create dependencies most security assessments don't consider. The attackers weaponize those dependencies by creating additional connections that amplify the impact of coordinated strikes. Foster began incorporating Sarah's network maps into her malware analysis, revealing that the sophisticated code segments she had been studying weren't designed to attack individual systems, but to coordinate simultaneous strikes across the entire shadow network. The malware contained communication protocols that would allow attackers to trigger cascading failures throughout interconnected infrastructure systems with surgical precision. Mitchell's power grid analysis took on new dimensions as he realized that electrical infrastructure was designed to fail safely in order to protect equipment from damage. But the shadow network connections meant that power failures would trigger automatic responses in water treatment systems, emergency services networks, and transportation management infrastructure that weren't designed to handle simultaneous disruptions. "They've turned our safety systems into weapons," Mitchell observed grimly. "Every automated response designed to protect one system will create failures in connected systems. The cascading effects will overwhelm any manual intervention capabilities we have available." The team's analysis revealed that the attackers had spent years studying American infrastructure resilience, identifying the backup systems, emergency protocols, and manual override procedures that were designed to maintain critical services during equipment failures. The shadow network had been engineered to compromise those backup systems simultaneously, creating conditions where traditional emergency responses would be impossible. Santos discovered evidence that the infiltration had extended beyond infrastructure. systems into the computer networks that managed emergency response coordination. Fire departments, police agencies, hospital emergency rooms, and disaster management organizations all relied on communication systems that had been quietly connected to the shadow network over multiple years. They can prevent emergency responders from coordinating assistance, Santos reported. When the infrastructure attacks begin, the people responsible for managing disaster response won't be able to communicate with each other or access the databases they need to deploy resources effectively. The sophistication of the preparation indicated resources that extended far beyond typical cyber warfare capabilities. The attackers had recruited or compromised personnel within dozens of infrastructure organizations, gaining the administrative access necessary to establish connections that appeared legitimate to security reviews. They had studied American emergency response procedures and identified vulnerabilities that could be exploited to prevent effective crisis management. Sarah's diagnostic protocols continued revealing new aspects of the shadow network as the primary team expanded their analysis to incorporate her discoveries. Each new scan uncovered additional connections that demonstrated the attack scope exceeded their worst-case scenarios. The attackers had created the capability to simultaneously disrupt every system that supported modern urban life while preventing organized responses to the resulting chaos. Dr. Foster coordinated the team's response with military precision, assigning specific analysis tasks that would map the shadow network's full extent and identify potential countermeasures. But their initial assessment revealed a sobering reality. The attackers held overwhelming tactical advantage due to years of preparation that had anticipated every standard cybersecurity response. Traditional defensive measures involved isolating compromised systems and rebuilding them from clean backup copies. But the shadow network's design meant that isolating any component would disrupt legitimate operational dependencies that were critical for maintaining essential services. The attackers had created a situation where defensive measures would cause almost as much disruption as the attack itself. Sarah found herself at the center of analysis efforts that required her unique understanding of system integration principles. The primary team's specialized expertise was essential for understanding individual technical components, but Sarah's knowledge of cross-system relationships was crucial for mapping vulnerabilities that existed between organizational boundaries. Working together, they began identifying potential intervention points where the shadow network could be disrupted without causing catastrophic failures in legitimate infrastructure operations. The process required understanding not just how systems were connected, but why those connections existed and what functions they served during normal operations. Their analysis revealed that the attackers had been exceptionally clever in their approach. They had used legitimate operational requirements to justify creating connections that served dual purposes. During normal operations, the shadow network actually improved efficiency and coordination between different infrastructure systems. Only during a coordinated attack would these connections become pathways for cascading failures. Time pressure intensified as monitoring systems detected increased activity within the shadow network. The attackers appeared to be conducting final preparations for triggering their coordinated strikes, testing communication pathways and verifying that all systems were positioned for maximum impact. The window for preventive action was closing rapidly. Sarah's transformation from backup personnel to critical team member accelerated as her expertise became essential for understanding threats that the primary team's specialized knowledge couldn't address alone. But their growing understanding of the attack's sophistication revealed challenges that would test the limits of their combined capabilities. The real battle was just beginning. At 2:34 a.m., monitoring stations across 3 states began detecting synchronized activation signals flowing through the shadow network. The attackers had initiated their final sequence, and the team had less than 40 minutes before coordinated strikes would begin crippling infrastructure systems from Boston to Atlanta. Director Reynolds had cleared the operations center of all non-essential personnel, leaving only the primary team and Sarah to implement countermeasures against a threat that could affect 60 million people. The solution Sarah proposed was both elegant and devastating to her own career prospects. Rather than attempting to dismantle the shadow network connections individually, which would take weeks and risk triggering the attack during defensive operations, she had identified a way to flood the entire network with legitimate diagnostic traffic that would overwhelm the attackers' command and control capabilities. Her plan required using her administrative access to system integration protocols across 17 different infrastructure organizations. Access that had been granted for routine maintenance operations, not for implementing emergency countermeasures that could be interpreted as unauthorized system manipulation. Successfully executing the plan would save millions of lives while simultaneously destroying her security clearance and ending her career in cybersecurity. Dr. Foster studied the technical specifications of Sarah's proposal with growing admiration and concern. This approach could work, but it requires coordinating diagnostic protocols across systems that were never designed to communicate at this level of intensity. The data volume could crash legitimate infrastructure operations, even if it stops the attack. Sarah had already calculated those risks. Her analysis showed that temporary disruptions to non-critical system functions would be preferable to the permanent damage that would result from coordinated infrastructure attacks. The plan would cause inconvenience and economic losses measured in hundreds of millions of dollars, but would prevent humanitarian catastrophe that could require years to repair. Mitchell focused on the power grid implications, running simulations that showed how diagnostic traffic floods would affect electrical transmission systems during peak overnight industrial usage. We'll need to coordinate with utility companies to reduce non-essential power loads before implementing the countermeasures. Otherwise, the diagnostic traffic could trigger protective shutdowns that create rolling blackouts across the region. The coordination requirements revealed the plan's most challenging aspect. Success depended on simultaneous implementation across multiple organizational boundaries, requiring cooperation from infrastructure managers who had never worked together on emergency operations. Sarah would need to contact personnel at water treatment facilities, transportation agencies, emergency services departments, and private companies that managed critical systems. Santos began establishing secure communication channels with infrastructure organizations, using emergency protocols that existed primarily on paper and had never been tested during actual crisis situations. Each contact required explaining the threat in terms that non-cybersecurity personnel could understand, while requesting authorization for system modifications that exceeded normal administrative privileges. The resistance was immediate and predictable. Infrastructure managers were trained to protect their systems from unauthorized modifications, especially during crisis situations when the risk of additional damage was highest. Many initially refused to grant Sarah the elevated access privileges she needed, viewing her requests as potential security threats rather than defensive measures. Time constraints forced Director Reynolds to intervene with authority that came directly from the Department of Homeland Security. Emergency declarations were issued that bypassed normal approval processes and granted Sarah temporary administrative control over critical infrastructure systems across multiple states. The authorizations carried legal protections for the organizations involved, but placed enormous responsibility on Sarah's shoulders. As Sarah began implementing diagnostic traffic floods across the shadow network, her screens filled with real-time data showing the effects of her countermeasures on legitimate system operations. Each diagnostic protocol she activated generated thousands of routine status queries that appeared normal to individual systems, but created network congestion that prevented the attackers' command signals from reaching their targets. The approach was working, but the side effects were more severe than her initial calculations had predicted. Airport traffic control systems began experiencing communication delays that forced temporary ground stops for arriving flights. Hospital networks slowed to the point where patient monitoring systems required manual backup procedures. Emergency services dispatch centers reverted to radio communication when their computer-aided dispatch systems became unresponsive. Dr. Foster monitored malware activity within infected systems, watching as the attacker's coordination signals became lost in the flood of diagnostic traffic that Sarah was generating. The sophisticated command and control capabilities that had taken years to develop were being neutralized by routine system queries that overwhelmed the network pathways the attackers had spent so much effort establishing. They're losing control of their coordinated timing, Foster reported with satisfaction. The malware is still active, but it can't receive the synchronization signals needed to trigger simultaneous strikes across multiple infrastructure systems. Mitchell tracked power grid stability as diagnostic protocols stressed communication. Systems that managed load balancing across the regional electrical network. Industrial facilities were reporting minor power quality issues as automated systems struggled to coordinate through networks that were saturated with Sarah's countermeasure traffic. The economic costs were mounting rapidly. Airlines faced delays that would cascade into schedule disruptions lasting for days. Manufacturing facilities experienced production slowdowns as their automation systems adapted to degraded communication capabilities. Financial markets would open to trading systems that were operating under emergency protocols. Due to network congestion, Sarah watched the mounting consequences of her actions with professional detachment that masked personal anguish. Every success indicator on her screens represented another aspect of her career that was being sacrificed to prevent catastrophe. The unauthorized system modifications she was implementing would be scrutinized by investigators who would question every decision, regardless of the outcomes. Santos detected signs that the attackers were attempting to adapt their approach, using backup communication pathways to re-establish coordination between compromised systems. They're trying to bypass the diagnostic traffic by switching to encrypted channels that weren't part of the original shadow network design. Sarah responded by expanding her countermeasures to target the backup pathways, using diagnostic protocols that reached deeper into infrastructure systems than her original plan had required. Each escalation increased the disruption to legitimate operations while further compromising her professional standing with regulatory agencies that would investigate the emergency response. The attackers' adaptations revealed their sophisticated preparation and resource depth. They had anticipated that primary coordination mechanisms might be discovered and had prepared alternative approaches that could maintain some level of coordinated capability. But their backup systems lacked the seamless integration of the shadow network, creating opportunities for Sarah's countermeasures to exploit timing vulnerabilities. Working with desperate efficiency, Sarah coordinated diagnostic floods that targeted every communication pathway the attackers might use to re-establish command and control over their distributed malware installations. The process required understanding network architectures that extended across organizational boundaries and through systems that existed primarily to support routine administrative functions. Dr. Foster's malware analysis confirmed that Sarah's expanding countermeasures were successfully disrupting the attackers' coordination capabilities. Individual malware installations remained active within infected systems, but they could no longer communicate with central command structures or coordinate their activation timing with other compromised systems. By 3:45 a.m., monitoring systems showed that the attackers' coordinated strike capability had been effectively neutralized. The malware remained embedded within infrastructure systems, but it could no longer function as a unified weapon capable of creating cascading failures across multiple critical networks. The immediate threat to millions of people had been eliminated through Sarah's willingness to sacrifice her own career for a defensive strategy that no textbook had ever described. The operations center fell quiet except for the hum of cooling systems and the soft sounds of keyboards as analysts began documenting the emergency response for inevitable investigations. Sarah stared at her screens, watching as diagnostic protocols continued their methodical work of maintaining network congestion that would prevent the attackers from re-establishing coordination capabilities. Director Reynolds approached her workstation with an expression that mixed gratitude with professional concern. "Ms. Chun, you've prevented a national catastrophe, but we need to discuss the implications of the methods you used. There will be investigations, hearings, and career consequences that I can't protect you from." Sarah nodded without taking her eyes from the displays that showed her countermeasures successfully maintaining their defensive effect. She had known the costs when she made her decision, had calculated them as carefully as she had analyzed the shadow network's vulnerabilities. Sometimes preventing disaster requires accepting personal destruction as the price of saving others. The real mission had never been about following protocol or protecting her career advancement opportunities. It had been about using whatever capabilities she possessed to prevent harm to people who would never know her name or understand what she had sacrificed for their safety. 3 weeks after the crisis, Sarah Chun sat in a sterile conference room at the Government Accountability Office, facing a panel of investigators who possessed impressive credentials but had never made a decision that could affect millions of lives. The questions came with predictable bureaucratic precision, each one designed to establish whether her unauthorized actions had violated federal regulations governing critical infrastructure protection. The official report would classify the incident as a network anomaly successfully contained through emergency protocols, with technical details redacted for national security purposes. No mention would be made of the shadow network that had taken years to establish, the coordinated attack that could have reduced major cities to pre-industrial conditions, or the backup systems analyst whose diagnostic protocols had prevented humanitarian catastrophe. Dr. Foster had testified earlier in the week, describing Sarah's contributions in carefully neutral language that satisfied legal requirements while avoiding specifics that could compromise ongoing security operations. Mitchell, Santos, and Director Reynolds had provided similar testimony, praising the team's collaborative response while deflecting questions about individual decision-making authority during emergency situations. The investigators never quite understood what they were evaluating. Their expertise lay in regulatory compliance and procedural oversight, not in the technical complexities of infrastructure protection or the split-second decisions required during crisis response. They knew that significant resources had been disrupted and that unauthorized system modifications had caused economic losses, but they couldn't grasp the scale of destruction that had been prevented. Sarah answered their questions with professional courtesy that masked profound exhaustion. She had spent weeks helping other agencies understand the shadow network's architecture, providing technical documentation that would guide security improvements across multiple infrastructure sectors. The work was important, but it felt like academic exercise compared to the life-or-death urgency of the crisis response. Her security clearance had been suspended, pending the investigation's conclusion, effectively ending her access to the classified systems where her expertise was most valuable. Private sector opportunities remained available, but they felt hollow after experiencing what it meant to use her knowledge to protect millions of people from threats they would never comprehend. The investigators' final questions focused on whether she would make the same decisions again, given complete knowledge of the consequences. Sarah's answer was immediate and unequivocal. Every economic loss, every regulatory violation, every career sacrifice had been justified by the alternative scenario that her actions had prevented. 2 months later, the Government Accountability office published its findings in a heavily redacted report that concluded emergency response procedures had been generally appropriate given available information and time constraints. Sarah received an official letter noting that while her actions had exceeded authorized parameters, the extenuating circumstances precluded disciplinary measures beyond the security clearance. Suspension. The letter was signed by officials who had never worked in crisis response environments and carried the bureaucratic tone of people who measured success through procedural compliance rather than lives saved. It acknowledged her technical contributions while carefully avoiding any language that might suggest heroism or exceptional performance under pressure. Sarah framed the letter and hung it in her new office at a private cybersecurity consulting firm, where her reputation for creative problem-solving under extreme pressure had attracted clients who needed expertise that couldn't be found in traditional corporate environments. Her work involved helping companies understand vulnerabilities that existed between different organizational systems, the kind of cross-boundary analysis that had revealed the shadow network. The consulting work was intellectually satisfying and financially rewarding, but it lacked the sense of purpose that had driven her during those critical hours when everything depended on her ability to see connections that others had missed. Private sector clients wanted to protect their assets and avoid regulatory penalties, not prevent national catastrophes or save lives on a massive scale. 6 months after the crisis, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her consulting office. Director Reynolds had retired from government service and was working for a nonprofit organization that studied infrastructure resilience and emergency response capabilities. He came with an offer that would change her life again, though in ways she couldn't immediately understand. The Department of Homeland Security is establishing a new position, Reynolds explained. Infrastructure Integration Analyst. Someone who can see the connections between different systems and identify vulnerabilities that traditional cybersecurity approaches miss. The position would come with a new security clearance specifically designed for cross-organizational analysis. The offer represented recognition that the government needed capabilities that didn't exist within traditional organizational structures. Sarah's unique combination of technical expertise and systems thinking had revealed blind spots in national security that could only be addressed by someone who understood how different pieces of critical infrastructure functioned as integrated systems. More importantly, the position would allow her to work on preventing future attacks that used the same cross-system approach that had nearly succeeded 6 months earlier. The shadow network had been dismantled, but the underlying vulnerabilities that had made it possible remained embedded within infrastructure systems that were designed for efficiency rather than security. Sarah's acceptance of the position marked the beginning of a new phase in her career that transcended the traditional boundaries between technical specialization and policy development. She began working directly with infrastructure organizations to identify and eliminate the kind of hidden connections that could be weaponized by sophisticated adversaries. Her work remained largely invisible to the public, whose daily lives depended on systems that functioned seamlessly due to protections they would never know existed. Airport passengers didn't realize that their flights operated on schedules that were possible because someone had eliminated vulnerabilities in air traffic control networks. Hospital patients never knew that their medical equipment operated reliably because communication systems had been redesigned to prevent cascading failures. The deeper truth that emerged from Sarah's experience wasn't about individual heroism or career advancement, but about the critical importance of understanding how complex systems interact with each other. Modern civilization depended on infrastructure networks that were so interconnected that failures in one domain could cascade through multiple sectors, creating vulnerabilities that traditional security approaches couldn't address. Sarah's background as backup personnel had actually been perfect preparation for understanding these vulnerabilities. While specialists focused on protecting individual systems, She had developed expertise in the spaces between systems, the connections and dependencies that made modern infrastructure function as an integrated whole. Her story became a case study, taught in cybersecurity programs, though the specific details remained classified for national security purposes. Students learned about the importance of cross-system analysis and the dangers of organizational silos that prevented comprehensive threat assessment. But they didn't learn about the specific threats that had been prevented, or the personal costs that had been paid to protect millions of people. The real legacy of that night in the operations center wasn't the technical countermeasures that had stopped a coordinated attack, but the recognition that preparing for modern threats required new approaches that transcended traditional organizational boundaries. The most dangerous vulnerabilities existed not within individual systems, but in the relationships between systems that no single organization was responsible for protecting. Sarah's transformation from backup personnel to critical infrastructure analysts reflected a broader shift in how national security experts understood the challenges of protecting interconnected systems. The threats that kept security professionals awake at night were no longer limited to attacks on individual targets, but involved adversaries who understood how to weaponize the connections that made modern life possible. Years later, when journalists tried to investigate the infrastructure crisis that had been prevented through emergency response measures, they found only heavily redacted reports and carefully worded official statements. The complete story remained classified, known only to the people who had lived through those critical hours when everything depended on someone who was never supposed to be more than backup personnel. But the systems that protected millions of people continued functioning with improved security because someone had been willing to see connections that others missed, to take risks that others avoided, and to sacrifice personal advancement for the sake of protecting people who would never know her name. Sometimes the most important victories are the disasters that never happen, prevented by people whose greatest qualification was their willingness to act when action was desperately needed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.